All right, time to prove some triangle congruence theorems. So the purpose of this lesson is we're going to prove that two triangles are congruent using relationships between angles and sides. So you must have a combination of three corresponding angles and or sides to prove that two triangles are congruent, okay? And there are 5 ways to prove that you have congruent triangles. So let's go over the 5 rules. So the first one is side, 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 and that's abbreviated SSS. And so what can happen is if I know that all 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to all 3 sides of another triangle, then I know the triangle has to be the exact same. So for example, we do it with congruent marks. And so here's one mark. So if I know AB and XY are the same, and if I know BC and YZ are the same, so notice they have a separate mark, and then if AC, we'll do 3 tick marks, and XZ are congruent, therefore I know ABC is going to be congruent to triangle XYZ. Okay? Alright, my dog just finished her bone, so it's going to be a quick video. Does that make sense? Yes. So if you have a tick mark here and a tick mark here, they're congruent. If you have 2 tick marks here, 2 tick marks here, they're congruent. 3 tick marks, 3 tick marks, you have a congruent triangle. So I know this one is the exact same as this one. Okay? That's the first theorem. The second theorem is called Sideangleside. So notice that this angle is in the middle of these 2 sides, so it's going to be true in our picture too. That's called an included angle because it's in between them. So for example, I'm going to mark a side. So let's say I can mark DE, and so DE and MN. Those are one of my congruent sides. So I've got that checked off. Now I need an angle. So I could either use D or E. I'm going to go ahead and go down and use E. And so I know E and N are the same. And then I need another side, okay? And they have to be connected. So it can't be this example DF over here. So I'm going to mark a side over here, and then a side over here, okay? So notice I have a side, an angle, and a side. Side, angle, side, okay? So if you have a side, angle, side relationship, you have 2 congruent triangles, okay? Another way that could be written, for example, I could have gone upwards, get a green marker. I could have known that this angle was the same as this angle, and then I could have known that this side was the same as this side, okay? So I have a side, an angle, and a side as well, okay? So if that is true, then you know you have 2 congruent triangles. So I know this congruent statement is true. D, E, and F, and then M, N, and O. All right, so we've done side, 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 angle, side. The next one is angle, side, angle. So notice you have 2 angles, and you have a side in the middle, and so that side is included because it's in between. So let's start off with an angle. Let's go angle L. So I've got angle L and angle T, okay? Now I need a side, and it has to be touching that angle, so we're going to go down here. So I know this side is congruent to this side, okay? Check. And now I need another angle, and it has to be right next to that side, and so it's going to have a 2 mark thing, okay? So I have one angle, a side, and an angle, and then I have an angle, side, and an angle. All right? So that's one example of how an angle, side, angle will look. Let me give you a really quick another one. So I could have an angle up here, an angle, a side, and an angle down here. Sorry, my angle marks are a little crazy today. Okay? So I have an angle, a side, and an angle. So that side is made up of those 2 angles, okay? Alright, so if I have angle, side, angle, I know my 2 triangles are congruent. They're the exact same. They've got the same measurement here as here. Alright, the other one, angle, angle, side. Okay, we've got all the combinations of A and S. So I need an angle, and a side. So this one's the most trickiest. So let's start off with an angle. I've got B and Y. B is congruent to Y. I need another angle. So let's go ahead and jump to C. Let's give this 2 marks because it's a different angle. So I have an angle, and then you have to have the side after that following angle. So here's the side, here's the side. Okay, so angle, angle, side. Or it's kind of written backwards, side, angle, angle. So if you see this, SAA, they just typically write it in alphabetical order, so it's angle, angle, side. Okay? So let me draw another example of one. So we can have an angle up here. We can have an angle down here. And then I'd have to have not the side in between it, but the outside side after your second angle. So angle, angle, side. Okay? So if you have an angle and a side, and the side is not included, so it's not in between, then you know that your two triangles are congruent. Okay? Alright, one more. It's called hypotenuse leg, and this is only true in right triangles. So you're going to see boxes to denote it's a right triangle. So you have to know the hypotenuse, and you have to know the leg. And so we know the hypotenuse is across from the 90-degree angle. So you'd have to have some kind of a mark on the hypotenuse. And then you have to have some mark on the leg. And the leg of the triangles are the other two sides. So I could have this mark, this mark, this mark, this mark. Okay? So this would be an example of a hypotenuse leg. I have a right angle, so I know it's true for that. I know the hypotenuse, I know the leg. You could have also had the other leg, for example, and that would have still been a hypotenuse leg. So if I would have had this as congruent, I would have still had a hypotenuse and a leg. Okay, so you don't need any angles for a hypotenuse leg. Okay? Alright, so if you have two congruent triangles, I went ahead and I wrote a congruent statement. So I had H, G, and then F, and then W, U, and V. Okay? So those are the 5 theorems that prove two triangles are congruent. Now you learned a lot of letters. You learned side, 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 angle, side, lots of combinations of the word letters S and A. Now, there are 2 theorems that do not prove congruent triangles. So the first one is angle, angle. Okay? If you know 2 angles, great, good for you. You can find the third, but that doesn't mean they're congruent. That just means they're similar, which we'll learn in Module 5. But this looks like a dilation from Module 2. So you've got a small triangle, a big triangle, but they're not the same. Okay? And then lastly, we don't have bad words in geometry. It's a way to remember that. So you cannot have angle, side, side. Okay? We cannot have bad words in geometry. Scribble it out. Can't have bad words in geometry. You also can't have bad words backward in geometry. Okay? So you can't have SSA because that's a bad word backwards. Okay? That proves absolutely nothing. I hope you're laughing. Okay. Now just listen. So you can make some marks based from previous knowledge of Module 1 with our vertical angles and alternate interior angles and all that jazz. So for example, on number 1, I see an example of vertical angles, right? I have this angle here, which I should make 2 marks because I already have an angle mark. Okay, so these are vertical angles. Okay, so based off of the previous picture, you only had 2 things. You had an angle and you had a side, and you're like, oh no, I can't prove anything. But if you make a mark based off of vertical angles, you now have 3 things. Okay? Now, to prove whether something is congruent, you only look at one of the triangles. Okay? So I have an angle and a side. Okay? So that would be angle, angle, side. Now the tricky part is you're going to want to go in between triangles, but that can't happen. So let me put this mark back here. So you can't say angle, 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 and jump over here. You can't say side, angle, side, and jump between triangles. So you can only look at the information in one triangle. Angle, angle, side. So number 1 would be congruent triangles. So yes, they'd be congruent because of angle, angle, side. Number 2, if you have 2 shapes touching each other and they're the exact same length, that means they're the same distance, and it means they're congruent. So you can go ahead and make this mark right here. We'll learn later on what that mark is called. But now looking at one of the triangles, let's look at this bottom one. I have a right angle, so let me double check hypotenuse leg. Well, that's the hypotenuse, and this is the leg. So I would say, yes, these triangles are congruent because of the hypotenuse leg theorem. That's not how you spell theorem. Alright, On number 3, I could make a mark right here because I've got two sides lined up next to each other. So I can go ahead and put a mark here. And then if I want to look at congruence, I'm going to look at one triangle, and I have an angle, and a side, and an angle. So that would be angle, side, angle. And so yes, they would be congruent because of angle, side, angle. Alright, last one. Got some vertical angles, and I actually have a vertical 90-degree angle, so I can go ahead and say that this angle down here is a right angle as well. So when you see a right angle, you should check to see if it's hypotenuse leg. It won't be all the time, but I have the hypotenuse and I have a leg. So I could say the exact same thing as I did up there for this bottom one. So yes, the two triangles are congruent because of the hypotenuse leg theorem. Okay? So now let's prove some triangles are congruent. So I've got 6 problems for you, and I want you to state if the triangles are congruent. So I need a yes or a no, and then if they are, tell me why. So are they yes by side, 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 yes by side, angle, side, yes by hypotenuse leg, what is it? And if they're not congruent, you can just put not congruent, not enough information. Okay? So why don't you try 1 through 6 and make some marks and see if they're congruent. Got yes for all of them. They are all congruent triangles. The reasoning for number 1 was side, angle, side. You had a side, you had angle, you had a side. Okay. Number 2 was angle, angle, side. So a common mistake would be someone would say angle, side, angle, but I jumped between my triangles right there, so you got to say within the same one. So angle, angle, and a side. Number 3 would be side, side, side. 4 would be side, angle, side. Just kidding. I made a mistake. No! Okay? So number 1, the left side looks like side, angle, side, right? But this one is ASS, which is a bad word, so they're not congruent. Okay? Tricky right there. Alright, number 5 was yes by hypotenuse leg. You had a hypotenuse, you had a leg, and you had a right angle. And then number 6 would be angle, side, angle. Okay? Alright, let me know if you have any questions on proving whether or not 2 triangles are congruent. Otherwise, we got one more quick little thing. So it says state what additional information is required in order to know that the triangles are congruent for the reasons given. So number 7 says I want to prove that these 2 triangles are congruent using angle, angle, side. Now I only have one piece of information. The good news is you can make marks without having to write it down. So I know I have vertical angles going on. Okay, so now I have an angle and I have a side, and I need to mark another angle basically. Okay, so I can't mark this angle right here because they need to be angle, side, angle. So I'd have to mark this one up here to have angle, angle, side. Now same thing, I'd have to mark this angle over here. I'd have to mark angle L for angle, angle, side. So I basically marked T and L. So I need to say angle T has to be congruent to angle L. That looks like 2 L's. Okay, so you don't count the marks you make based off the being vertical or touching like over here. You would have to tell me what the third mark would have to be. Okay, so why don't you try 8, 9, and 10. So see if you can make a mark and then give me the third piece of information that you would need to see whether or not the triangles were congruent. So press pause and try them on your own. Please ignore my terrible handwriting. I'm at a computer at home and it's quite hard to write on a MacBook without a marker handy. So number 8, you should have got that DH should have been congruent to HE because you can make this mark because they're touching. And so the third piece, you need to know these 2 sides over here. You could have had D, that's not DH, that should be DE. What was I thinking? Doop. Alright, so you should have had DE was congruent to HE, or you could have flip-flopped the order and said ED and EH, okay? But order does matter in these problems. Number 9, you could have marked vertical angles, and so then for angle, side, angle, you would have had to have the included side, and so it'd have to be this one right here. So you could have said IJ and XJ, or you could have said JI and JX, had to be congruent. Lastly, side angle side. This one was tricky because you couldn't just say angle x is congruent to angle y. Since you had two angles coming off of one letter, remember in Module 1, we have to name that angle with 3 letters. And so this would have to be the angle for side angle side. So I said WXY had to be congruent to CYX. And you could have flipped that order and said YXW was congruent to XYC. Okay? Alright, so now you know the 5 ways to prove that 2 triangles are congruent. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, get to practicing.